Hello, and welcome back to Introduction to Genetics and Evolution. Now, in the past, we've talked about recombination. We've talked about the process of recombination, primarily in the context of transmission genetics and genetic mapping. Now, the question I want to ask you today is, what are the evolutionary advantages of sex and recombination? Those two things are intrinsically tied together. Basically, why do we see so much recombination within species? Well, I have a cute subtitle for today's lecture. That is, still more reasons that recombination rocks. Now, sex and recombination are intrinsically tied together, so let's first explore sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction. Now, there are several forms of asexual reproduction, some of which you may have heard of. Now, asexual reproduction can be through binary fission, where you have basically a single cell. It splits into two cells that are essentially complete organisms in and of themselves. You can have budding, as depicted here on this slide with the hydra. You see the little baby hydras coming off the mom hydra. We obviously don't do that. My arm can't grow off into a kid that grows up. You can have parthenogenesis, which is offspring that come out from unfertilized eggs. That's actually observed in various insect species. All these processes produce exact genetic replicas of the parent. Basically, they produce clones. Sexual reproduction, in contrast, involves the union of genetic material from a mom and a dad, or two parents. It doesn't have to be a mom and a dad. And they're put together, and then ultimately, before that new organism passes on its offspring, its genetic material can be shuffled in its gametes. Now, what process shuffles this genetic material in the gametes? Well, it's our favorite process, recombination. Now, you may not know this, but there are several benefits to asexual reproduction. Well, first, with asexual reproduction, every individual can make babies directly. So, in contrast with sexual reproduction, as we humans do, you actually need to find, if you're a male, you need to find a female in order to produce offspring. With asexual reproduction, anybody can just butt off a baby. So, this is potentially a good thing. Similarly, with asexual reproduction, you don't need to go out and find mates. So this is something that sometimes involves a lot of energy. You have to sometimes have these characteristics that may actually be maladaptive in general, but are good for attracting mates. So this is actually a big advantage to asexual reproduction. In contrast, sexual reproduction requires that you actually go and woo your potential mates. And finally, with asexual reproduction, offspring actually only get, with asexual reproduction, offspring get all your genes. In contrast with sexual reproduction, offspring only get half of your genes. So it seems like overall there's a lot of benefits to asexual reproduction. You can pass on more of your genes. You don't need the intermediary. You don't need to go hunting and wooing mates. Nonetheless, we find that sexual reproduction is very, very common. And this is particularly true in the animal, plant, and fungal kingdoms. We tend to see for many of these species, they only have sexual reproduction. And those few that do have asexual reproduction, it's often not complete. That basically they will go through a few generations of asexual reproduction, and then they will have a sexual phase. So we see all these benefits of asexuality on the one hand, but on the other hand, sexual reproduction is very, very common. Why is this? Well, the benefits come from our friend recombination. So I'm going to give you two major reasons, but there's actually a slew of reasons that contribute to why sexual reproduction and recombination are beneficial. The first one we'll talk about is that recombination makes combinations of alleles across two or more loci that may be advantageous. So imagine that, for example, to have maximal fitness, you need to have the big A allele at one of your loci, and you need to have the big B allele at another locus. How do you put these things together? Recombination facilitates that. And I'll show you that in just a second. Now, this is especially important when you have epistasis, or interactions between loci, that favor particular combinations. So let's use an example. Let's imagine, just as I was saying before, that you have a starting population where everybody's little a, little b, little b. Your optimal genotype has a capital A and a capital B. But mutations from little a to big A are very rare, and mutations from little b to big B are very rare. So you have this population that are mostly little a, little b, and every now and then a mutation crops up. Well, there's a big A. Well, that's good. That's still not the optimal. Well, there's a big B. That's good. That's still not the optimal. There's a big B. There's a big A. If you only have asexual reproduction, this big A and this big B will never come together. Even if they have kids together, well, they're not having kids together if it's asexual reproduction, But if in some way they interacted, you would not put this big A with this big B into one individual. So the question is, how could you put this genotype, big A, big B, little b together? If you have only asexual reproduction, you basically have to wait for that mutation to arise. So here, this individual has a big A, you have to wait for a big B mutation to come up in either this individual or one of its offspring in the future. In this individual here, you'd have to wait for a big A to arise either in this individual or in one of its offspring. You have to wait for mutations. So without recombination, you need to wait a very long time to get the optimal genotype. In contrast, if you have recombination, you can accelerate adaptation, that basically this individual could have a baby with this individual, and some of the offspring would have that optimal genotype. So recombination can make advantageous mutations get together much more rapidly. This allows for more efficient adaptation. The second reason is related. Recombination basically helps you get rid of bad mutations. And in this regard, it helps you create or restore, and you see what I mean in just a second, mutation-free offspring. So let me illustrate this. Let's imagine a case of several independent lineages that are all asexual. So here are your 4 lineages here. There's the first individual, second, third, and fourth. This right here on the far right is depicting the number of detrimental mutations that we have per individual in that generation. So in this case, nobody has any bad mutations. Everybody's got a 0, and the range we see here is a 0. So let's wait 10 generations. Oh, we had a little mutation arise here. So this individual is a little bit less fit than all the rest of these. Well, guess what? Every offspring that comes from this individual is going to have that same bad mutation. He has no way to get rid of it. There's no way for him to eliminate that. So all his offspring are doomed to carry this bad mutation. These ones are still all okay. Well, what's going to happen after more time? Well, we'll have more mutations arising here, 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 here. Eventually, as you see, there's a range of 0 to 1 bad mutations, 0 to 1, a couple more have 1, a couple more have 1. Down here, the range is 1 to 2. We actually have no individuals left in the population after a very long period of time that are lacking bad mutations. Everybody has bad mutations. So in this regard, the population as a whole is getting more sickly. And in fact, the population gets worse or sicker and worse every single generation. So a few generations later, you might see this distribution of number of bad mutations. So again, nobody has 0 bad mutations. The previous example we saw, it was just 1 to 2, but maybe after a while it's a hump around 3. Very few individuals have 1. More have 2, more have 3 bad mutations. You wait a little bit longer, you lose the 0 and 1, and now everybody has 2 or more bad mutations. Essentially, again, the population gets worse and worse because individuals tend to accumulate these mutations, and they have no way to shed them. Right? There's no way to get this good version of this gene and this good version of that gene and put them together. This process is called Muller's ratchet. If any of you are familiar with a ratchet, it's something that actually will only turn things in one direction. In this case, the analogy here is that the population is getting worse. You turn it in one direction. There's no way to move the socket the other way. Now, if you had recombination, you actually can get some offspring that don't have bad mutations. So here are 2 individuals that are both carrying 2 bad mutations. This one has, in this case, the red is indicating a bad mutation rather than a good one. So this one has bad allele at A, a bad allele at B. This one has a bad allele at C, a bad allele at D. Well, we cross them together. Some individuals, some of the offspring from this will actually be worse. They'll have 4 bad mutations. Those will be very bad. Some will be comparable. This one has 2 bad mutations, but it has a different combination of bad mutations than either of the parents. But some will be better. This is the critical element. You can actually recreate the 0 mutation class. You can recreate some individuals that have no bad mutations. This one will reproduce more. This will reproduce some, and this will probably be the most poor reproduction. So eventually, this is the type that will spread within the population. So overall, we'd have to say recombination is good despite the many costs of sex, because recombination can produce these advantageous combinations of alleles, as I showed you, and in that regard, it can accelerate adaptation. Recombination also allows the population to get rid of or unload itself from these bad mutations. Essentially, it stops the ratchet. Now, this will especially be true if you're living in a variable environment. If you're in a very constant environment, then maybe not having recombination isn't so bad. But if you have a variable environment, you're essentially hedging your bets by producing more varied offspring. So this is one of the many ways that recombination is really good for a species, and this is why we tend to think that recombination is very, very common when we look across species, particularly animals, plants, and fungi. Now, what does recombination do in terms of molecular evolution? Now, again, we've shown that it can combine good mutations, we've shown that it can get rid of bad mutations, but how does it affect neutral sequences, sequences that really don't matter? How does it affect how much variation there is present in nucleotide sequence, this variation that has no particular effect on fitness? Well, we'll come back to that in the next set of videos. Thank you.